That night, Ethan went through every document he had on the community's budget and expenditures. He wasn't expecting to find anything blatant. Maggie was too smart for that, but he was looking for inconsistencies, anything that didn't add up. And it didn't take long to find one. A recent expense report listed thousands of dollars in purchases for public maintenance supplies, but there was no record of where those supplies had actually been used. No new public projects, no community upgrades that matched the materials listed. It was a black hole in the budget, a perfect place to hide stolen inventory. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was bigger than he had thought. It wasn't just about him. They had been doing this to the whole neighborhood, skimming money and materials under the guise of community improvements. And no one had ever questioned it because it all looked legitimate on paper. The question now was what to do with that information. If he went to the police, there was a chance they'd ignore him. This wasn't some obvious break-in with clear evidence. It was a carefully orchestrated fraud. And unless he had undeniable proof, they'd likely dismiss it as a civil matter. If he confronted Maggie directly, she'd just double down, making his life even more difficult. No, he needed something solid, something she couldn't talk her way out of. He needed to catch her in the act. Ethan spent the next 2 days setting up his trap. He placed a fake order for a batch of high-end materials, the kind that would be too tempting for them to ignore. He made sure the delivery was scheduled for a time when he wouldn't be home, leaving the garage seemingly vulnerable. But this time, he had cameras hidden inside, positioned to capture every angle. Then he waited. And sure enough, 2 nights later, just past midnight, his phone buzzed with a motion alert. Ethan sat up, grabbing the tablet connected to his security feed. The grainy image resolved into a familiar figure, Maggie Bennett. And she wasn't alone. 3 men were with her, all dressed in dark clothes, moving quickly as they loaded his newly delivered supplies into an unmarked truck. Ethan felt a slow, cold satisfaction settle in his chest as he watched them work, completely unaware that they were being recorded from multiple angles. It was over. They just didn't know it yet. Ethan watched the screen with an eerie sense of calm as Maggie and her accomplices moved through his garage, working with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They didn't hesitate, didn't waste time looking for what they needed. They already knew. They went straight for the freshly delivered supplies, stacking them neatly in the bed of the unmarked truck, securing the load like professionals. This wasn't just casual theft, it was organized, systematic. They had a routine, they had a method, and up until now, they had never been caught. He should have been furious. The violation of his home, the arrogance of it, the sheer audacity of Maggie personally being involved in the theft. It should have sent him into a rage. But instead, he felt a cold certainty settle over him, the kind of focus that had served him well in his career. He had been waiting for this moment, for proof, and now he had it. He recorded the footage from multiple angles, ensuring there was no way they could claim a misunderstanding. He captured their faces, their movements, even the license plate on the truck. They weren't just stealing from him, they were burying themselves. But catching them in the act was only half the battle. Now he had to decide how to use it. Going straight to the police was the obvious move, but Ethan had spent enough time in bureaucratic systems to know that reality was rarely that simple. He couldn't afford to underestimate Maggie's reach. She had influence, connections. There was a chance she had people in law enforcement who would downplay the complaint, twist it into something insignificant, maybe even try to turn it against him. He needed to control the narrative before she could manipulate it. So, instead of calling the cops immediately, Ethan did something else. He waited. The next morning, he went about his day as if nothing had happened. He took his usual morning jog, nodded to the neighbors, even waved at Maggie when he passed her near the community center. She didn't look the least bit nervous. She had no idea that her entire world was about to come crashing down. That was good. It meant she wasn't on high alert yet. It meant she would still make mistakes. His first stop was a local lawyer, one who specialized in property disputes and fraud cases. He laid out the situation in careful, precise detail, showing the footage, the documentation, everything he had gathered. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Laura Hayes, leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she watched the videos. "This is bad," she finally said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of something else, approval, maybe, or amusement. "For them, I mean. This is blatant. They can't talk their way out of this. Ethan nodded. That's what I figured. She tapped her pen against the desk. What do you want out of this? Justice, he said flatly. But more than that, I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. To me. To anyone else. Laura considered that, then nodded. All right. We can work with that. First thing, we're filing a legal complaint not just about the theft, but about the fraudulent inspections, the financial mismanagement, everything. You're not the only VY Tim here. If we do this right, we won't just take down Maggie, you'll dismantle the whole operation. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what he was about to set in motion. Good. The complaint was drafted and filed within the day, but Ethan wasn't done. He knew Maggie would find out soon enough, and when she did, she'd retaliate. He needed to be ready for whatever she threw at him next. And she didn't disappoint. The very next morning, Ethan received a new violation notice, this one more aggressive than the others. It claimed he was in breach of contract for installing unauthorized security measures, stating that his cameras and additional locks were disruptive to the uniform aesthetic of the community. The fine attached was absurdly high, clearly an attempt to intimidate him. Ethan smirked. He had been expecting this. But it didn't stop there. An hour later, a maintenance crew arrived at his house, claiming they had been sent for a mandatory inspection. When he refused them entry, they took photos of his property, muttering into their radios before VYing with thinly veiled threats about further violations. By noon, his internet connection mysteriously went out. When he called his provider, they informed him that his account had been flagged for suspicious active VY and was temporarily suspended pending re-VYEW. By evening, an anonymous complaint had been filed against him with local law enforcement, alleging that he had been VYing erratically and making threatening remarks toward members of the community board. A patrol car showed up at his house, an officer politely but firmly informing him that there had been concerns about his mental state. Ethan played it cool, pro-VYing the officer with his lawyer's contact information, keeping his tone calm and measured. He knew exactly what was happening. Maggie was throwing everything she had at him, trying to overwhelm him, isolate him, wear him down until he caved. She was making the same mistakes so many others had made before she thought he would break. She thought wrong. Ethan didn't just endure the onslaught, used it against her. Every new violation, every harassment attempt, every underhanded move she made was meticulously documented, added to his growing case. He started reaching out to other residents, carefully feeling out who else had been targeted. The stories poured in: people who had been fined into financial distress, homeowners who had been forced to sell because they couldn't keep up with the constant fees and penalties, residents who had mysteriously lost valuable property only to see similar items turn up in new community improvement projects. Maggie hadn't just been running a theft operation, she had been systematically bleeding the entire neighborhood dry, using fines, fear, and manipulation to control everything and everyone around her. And Ethan was about to expose it all. His lawyer, Laura, moved quickly, filing additional claims and gathering testimonies from affected residents. The evidence piled up undeniable and damning. Ethan made sure the case reached the right people, bypassing anyone who might be compromised. He went directly to state authorities, ensuring that local connections wouldn't be enough to protect Maggie. When the hammer finally fell, it did so with a resounding crash. 3 days later, the first wave hit. State investigators showed up at the community office, requesting financial records, inspection logs, and maintenance reports. By the afternoon, Maggie was seen VYing the office in a hurry, her usual composed demeanor cracking, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. The next morning, news broke that an official audit had been launched into the community board's financial practices. Maggie tried to fight it, scrambled to cover her tracks, issuing emergency board meetings, sending out frantic emails filled with excuses and reassurances. But it was too late. The people she had stepped on for years, the ones she had fined, bullied, and stolen from, they weren't afraid of her anymore. They started coming forward, sharing their own stories, adding their voices to the growing storm. The power Maggie had built for herself, the empire of fear and control she had spent years constructing, was crumbling beneath her feet. Ethan watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, but he wasn't done yet. Because Maggie wasn't just going to lose her position, she was going to lose everything. Ethan had seen people unravel before, and Maggie Bennett was no exception. The cracks in her perfect composure had started small subtle shifts in her expression, clipped responses where there had once been confident deflections. But now, those cracks had widened into something impossible to ignore. Over the past few days, as investigators dug deeper into the community's financials and testimonies piled up against her, Maggie had gone from carefully measured arrogance to outright desperation. Her first move had been denial. She had tried to dismiss the accusations as baseless, claiming that Ethan was leading some kind of vendetta against her. But when more residents came forward, sharing eerily similar stories of property mysteriously disappearing, unjustified fines, and unauthorized access to their homes, her second move was to shift the blame. She had called for an emergency board meeting, attempting to paint herself as the victim of a conspiracy, insisting that any financial inconsistencies were the fault of lower-level administrators who had acted without her knowledge. Ethan had anticipated this. He had seen the way people like Maggie operated, how they built their power on the assumption that no one would ever stand up to them, how they manipulated others into taking the fall when things went wrong. But this time, it wasn't going to work. Because this time, he had proof. He walked into that board meeting like a man who already knew the outcome, his presence alone enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. Maggie was already seated at the head of the long conference table, flanked by the remaining board members, all of whom looked varying degrees of uncomfortable. A few of them still wore the expressions of people who hadn't yet decided which way to lean, waiting to see if Maggie would somehow manage to turn the tide in her favor. Ethan didn't give her the chance. He placed a thick folder on the table in front of him and calmly flipped it open. The first page was a still image from his security footage, showing Maggie and her accomplices in his garage, caught in the act of loading stolen materials into their truck. He slid it across the table, watching the color drain from her face as the board members leaned in to get a closer look. "Let's start with this," he said, his voice even and controlled. "Then we can move on to the financial records, the fraudulent inspections, and the property violations you've been using to extort homeowners for years." Maggie's hands tightened into fists on the table, her carefully composed mask slipping as she realized there was no talking her way out of this. "This is absurd," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "This footage could be doctored. There's no context here." Ethan cut her off with a sharp, humorless laugh. "Context? You want context? Fine." He pulled out a second folder, filled with written testimonies from residents who had experienced the same pattern of theft and coercion. "Here's context testimonies from multiple homeowners detailing exactly how you've been running this operation. And let's not forget the financial discrepancies." He tapped another stack of documents. Thousands of dollars in purchases supposedly meant for community improvements that never actually happened. Funds that just disappeared. Want to explain that? The silence in the room was suffocating. One of the board members, an older woman who had always seemed uneasy in Maggie's presence, cleared her throat. "Maggie," she said hesitantly, "is there anything you want to say about this?" Maggie's nails dug into the table as she fought to maintain her composure. For a brief moment, Ethan saw the wheels turning in her head, calculating whether she had any chance of salvaging this. But she wasn't used to being backed into a corner. She was used to controlling the narrative, to intimidating people into submission. And that's why she made her final, fatal mistake. Her expression hardened, her voice regaining a fraction of its previous authority as she straightened in her chair. "You have no real case against me," she said coldly. "Even if you take this to law enforcement, all you have are accusations and circumstantial evidence. No judge is going to waste their time on this." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone with deliberate ease. He hit a button on the screen, and a recorded voice filled the room. Maggie's voice, a conversation she had never meant for anyone else to hear. "I don't care what we have to do, just get rid of him. Make his life miserable until he either pays up or moves out. The last thing I need is some ex-forensic accountant thinking he can play detective in my neighborhood." The room went deathly silent. Maggie's face turned a shade paler, her breath catching as she realized what had just happened. Ethan let the recording play out in full before locking his phone and tucking it back into his pocket. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his voice quiet but carrying enough weight to make every syllable land like a hammer. "I don't need a judge," he said. "I just need the truth. And now, everyone here knows exactly what that is." One of the board members abruptly stood up, pushing his chair back with enough force to scrape against the floor. "I want no part of this," he muttered, shaking his head. Others quickly followed suit, murmuring among themselves, their gazes darting toward Maggie with a mixture of disgust and self-preservation. Maggie shot to her feet, her hands slamming against the table. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "All of you. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Ethan met her gaze with an unshakable calm. "Yeah," he said. "I'm putting an end to this." The door burst open before she could respond. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by a stern-looking investigator holding a thick folder of her own. "Maggie Bennett," the investigator said, her voice all business. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy." Maggie went rigid, her eyes darting between Ethan and the officers. For a second, it looked like she might try to argue, to fight, to find some last-ditch escape. But there was nothing left for her. The board had turned against her, the evidence was overwhelming, and Ethan had beaten her at her own game. She barely moved as the officers pulled her hands behind her back, snapping the cuffs into place. As they led her out of the room, she turned her head just enough to meet Ethan's gaze one last time. "This isn't over," she whispered. Ethan didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply met her stare with an unwavering resolve. "Yeah," he said, "it is." And as she was escorted out of the building, the weight that had settled over the neighborhood for years finally began to lift. The days following Maggie Bennett's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media coverage, and long-overdue revelations that sent ripples through the entire community. The tightly wound system of control she had built over the years was unraveling at an astonishing speed, exposing every corrupt practice, every fabricated fine, and every manipulated financial record. Residents who had once lived in fear of her petty authoritarianism now spoke freely, recounting their own experiences. Each new testimony added another nail in the coffin of her once untouchable empire. Ethan, for his part, stayed out of the spotlight as much as possible. He had never sought attention. He hadn't exposed Maggie for personal gain or revenge. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because people like her thrived when no one challenged them, and because he refused to let himself become another one of her victims. But even as he tried to return to his normal routine, the reality of what had happened continued to unfold around him. The financial investigation revealed that Maggie had been siphoning money from the community budget for years, funneling funds meant for neighborhood maintenance into private accounts. The so-called renovations she had arranged for certain residents had been little more than a front for laundering stolen goods, materials taken from homeowners like Ethan, repurposed, and sold back to the very people she claimed to be helping. Then there were the kickbacks. Contractors, security firms, even local officials, many had been complicit in her schemes, turning a blind eye in exchange for financial incentives or preferential treatment. Some of them, like the maintenance crews who had harassed Ethan under Maggie's orders, had quietly disappeared, severing ties the moment they realized the fallout was inevitable. Others, particularly those who had benefited the most from Maggie's corruption, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. A handful of lower-ranking board members resigned preemptively, distancing themselves from the scandal in a desperate attempt to avoid further investigation. Maggie, of course, denied everything. Even after her arrest, she tried to play the victim, claiming she had been set up, that the entire ordeal was a coordinated attack against her. But the evidence was overwhelming. The footage of her breaking into Ethan's garage, the financial records showing funds being funneled into unauthorized projects, the dozens of witnesses willing to testify against her. Her attempts to fight the charges crumbled in court, and when she was finally sentenced to several years for fraud, theft, and conspiracy, it was clear there was no coming back from this. For the first time in years, the community was free. The shift was almost immediate. The board, now under new leadership, repealed dozens of Maggie's arbitrary rules, eliminated unnecessary fees, and restructured the way decisions were made to ensure no single person could hold that kind of unchecked power again. Homeowners who had been unfairly targeted were given financial relief, their fraudulent debts erased. Some, like Ethan, were compensated for their stolen property, though no amount of restitution could undo the damage Maggie had caused over the years. But the most noticeable change wasn't in the policy, it was in the people. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, afraid to challenge the status quo, began to take an active role in their own community. Conversations that had once been whispered in private now happened in the open. People shared their stories, their frustrations, their relief at finally being free from Maggie's reign. For Ethan, the VY Tory was satisfying, but it didn't change who he was. He had never wanted to be part of some grand crusade. He had only wanted to protect himself, to keep what was his. He still preferred solitude, still spent most of his time in his workshop, surrounded by the quiet hum of his tools. But there was a difference now. When he passed his neighbors, they no longer averted their eyes. They nodded in acknowledgement, in gratitude. Some even stopped to talk, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. It was an adjustment, but not an unwelcome one. One afternoon, as Ethan was sanding down a new project, a shadow fell across his workbench. He looked up to see Walter, the older neighbor who had first warned him about how things worked around here. "Figured I'd stop by," Walter said, eyeing the half-finished table Ethan was working on. "Looks good." Ethan smirked slightly. Not bad for a guy who's apparently a disruptive influence on the community. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Maggie thought she had us all under her thumb. Didn't expect someone like you to come along." He leaned against the door frame. "Not everyone would have fought back the way you did." Ethan shrugged. "Did what had to be done." Walter nodded slowly, then gestured toward the table. "You selling that?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Thinking of buying?" "Thinking about it," Walter said, glancing around the workshop. "You ever build decks?" Ethan paused, then let out a short laugh. "You need a deck, Walter?" "Maybe," Walter said with a grin. "Maybe I just like working with people who aren't crooks." Ethan considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." The two men stood there in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the neighborhood carrying in from outside, the faint laughter of kids playing down the street, the distant hum of someone mowing their lawn. The kind of everyday peace Ethan had almost forgotten was possible. Things weren't perfect. There would always be problems, always be people trying to take advantage of others. But for now, at least, the worst of it was over. And Ethan Hayes had no regrets. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.